go for Noreen Gosch.
Okay. Before September 5th, 1982, I was a homemaker, housewife, mother. I lived what I've considered to be a normal, happy life, doing things with my kids, going to ball games, baking cookies, doing all the mom things. And then on September 5th, my entire world blew apart when someone kidnapped my son, Johnny, while he was delivering his Sunday morning papers in West Des Moines, Iowa. That morning started out very early for him, like any other day. He left the house at about 5:45 in the morning. He headed down the street pulling his little wagon and our dog riding along with him. He got as far as the corner, about a block from our home, when a man stopped him and asked for directions. Johnny was always instructed not to talk to strangers, so he didn't go over to the car and spend time. The other kids at the corner, who were the witnesses, were the ones that reported all of this to me. As Johnny walked away from this man, the man suddenly made a U-turn in the middle of the street with his car and sped back up the street and pulled in right where all the boys were gathering their papers, folding them, and preparing to deliver their own routes. The man shut off the engine to the car, opened the passenger door, and slid his feet out onto the curb and started talking to all the boys. He spoke with a very slurred speech pattern, according to what I was told by the witnesses. Johnny turned to one of the witnesses, Mike, who was 16, and he said, "This man is nuts. There's something wrong with him. I'm scared and I'm leaving." Johnny threw all his papers into the wagon and took off down the street. The other boys that were at the corner at that time also left. There was a 44-year-old attorney that had pulled up with his car to grab his son's papers, and he had paid attention to the man and the license plate, but didn't know that a crime was about to occur, and he left. Johnny, as he was walking down the street, was just minding his own business when Mike heard our little dog growl. At that very moment, the man who had driven up in the car suddenly pulled himself back in the car, slammed the door, started the engine, and then reached up with his hand and clicked the dome light 3 times. At that very moment, Mike looked down the street after Johnny, saw Johnny walking along, and then saw another man come out between 2 houses and follow my son. The man was about 6'3" and stayed about a half a block behind Johnny. I doubt very much that my son even knew he was being followed. He then went around the corner, out of the direct eyesight of Mike. A few seconds later, Mike heard a car door slam, the screeching of tires, and he saw that very same car that had been at the corner where he was sitting earlier run the stop sign, turn left, which was north, and head straight towards the interstate, which is out of town. This all took place in approximately 12 minutes from the time my son left home. At the time, we were asleep. His father and I were home asleep. We did not know our son was kidnapped. Normally, the routine would have been for Johnny to come in and wake up his father to go with him on the paper route. That morning, for some reason that I do not know today, Johnny did not come in and get his dad. He went on the route alone. That was the only morning in over 13 months of him having the route that he ever did the paper route alone. His dad had always been with him. Our nightmare just exploded. The phone began to ring. Neighbors didn't get their papers. Johnny's father, said, "I'll go and help him. He must be just running late." He left the house, came roaring back in the driveway a few minutes later and said, "Call the police immediately. Johnny's gone. Somebody took him." His wagon was sitting up on the street corner, full of papers. Not even the bundle ties had been cut. I called the police and reported that we had a missing child. It took them 45 minutes before they ever showed up at our home. In that 45 minutes, I got busy on the phone and I called for my other two children to come home. One was working at a pancake house. The other was at college in a nearby town. And I knew that it was serious. I knew we had to gather our family together. I called friends all around town, asking them to begin to search for my son. I called the Des Moines Register district manager for our area, Johnny's direct superior. She came over to the house and brought the names of all the boys and everyone that would have been at that paper drop site that morning. I called every one of them. By the time the police got to my home, I had a full description of the man, I had a description of the car, a partial license plate number, and every detail that every witness could remember. When the police got there, I filled out the missing persons report and signed it, and the cop looked at me and said, "Did your son ever run away before?" And I said, "He's never run away, period. Why would you say such a thing? Didn't you just listen to me when I told you what the witnesses had said?" And he became a little disgruntled, the fact that I would even utter a question or a statement like that. And he said he had to go back to the station. He left our home, and it was now about 8:30 in the morning. We did not see another representative of the police department until 3 in the afternoon. We were on our own. We organized search parties. We had contacted the media. We asked for help from the public. Thousands of people came forward in West Des Moines and formed search parties and searched the state parks, searched cornfields, searched everything around the area where one might think a violent crime could have occurred and perhaps a body might have been dumped if Johnny had been murdered. At one point, 20 of the searchers came back to the house, furious, angry. They came to the door and said, "I thought you wanted help." And I said, "I do want help. What's wrong?" And they told me that our police chief showed up at one of the state parks, drunk, got up on top of a picnic table, and shouted through a bullhorn, a loudspeaker, for everyone to go home because Johnny Gosch was nothing but a damn runaway. That police chief is no longer in office. His name was Orville Cooney, and he was shamed and had to leave office and was later arrested for shoplifting. So his character was not anything of a sterling nature to begin with. But that was the first big red flag that took place on our case. The fact that the police weren't going to look. We were on our own. At that point, I thought, well, the FBI is supposed to come in on the case. They always did on the FBI story with that from Jim Zimbalist Jr. So I called the FBI office. They did send 2 agents to my home. They sat at the table slurping down coffee and explained to me that they would not enter the case because basically they had no crime. And I looked at them and said, "I have no son. What are you going to do about it?" And they said the police chief had told them that this case did not require the FBI and they were not to be in the case. Day turned into night and into the next day and into the next night with nothing but confusion and absolute turmoil. Our phone rang every 15 minutes, day and night. We had tremendous press coverage. All of the local stations began to show Johnny's picture, and the news began to spread throughout Iowa and to other states that a young boy had been ripped off the street. Still, the police were still waiting 72 hours to act. And I can remember walking into the police station and asking the police chief that if there had been a bank robbery, would they have called it runaway money for the first 72 hours, or would they have begun to work on it? Well, he didn't have an answer for me, but did ask me to leave the station. At that point, I knew that no matter what we did, it would have to be our own efforts to find our son, that we were not going to get the help from the police. So I began doing a thorough search, calling people, asking for recommendations for a private investigator. I got several names, and within a week or two, I was already out interviewing private investigators to take the case. One man did agree to take the case, and we brought him to Des Moines and began to do the preliminary things to start an investigation for a missing child. The second day that the man was on the job, he was going to set a surveillance at the site where Johnny was kidnapped at the same time of the morning, to watch local traffic and cars. 2 squad cars pulled up from the West Des Moines Police Department and arrested my private investigator and tried to charge him with vagrancy for just sitting there. I could see that they weren't going to accept the idea of a private investigator on the case either. So I went to the police chief and I said, if you're not going to work on my son's case, that's your choice. But step aside because I am. And I informed him that I did not want to see or hear again that my private investigators would be disturbed or arrested. They were licensed in Iowa to operate, and he had fair warning to back off if he was not going to do the job. He decided to back off. He didn't do the job either, but I had good investigators, and we began to gather information. One very important piece of information that we did get came from an interview. The private investigator brought in associates from his office, spread them out in a radius from our home, and they did house-to-house interviews. During one of the interviews, one of the neighbors told him that he had seen a van parked the wrong direction on the street with the motor running, and it was a loud engine. So it caught his attention, and he watched for a little while out the window, and he saw a car pull up next to the van and saw that 2 men were loading something long wrapped in a blanket from the car to the van, and then they all jumped into their vehicles and drove away. He thought it was odd at the time, but at the time he did not know a kidnapping had just happened a few blocks away. We kept that information. We did not share it with law enforcement. And I did that for a reason. Because I knew that someday somebody was going to come forward with that piece of information. And if it had not been broadcast through the media, in newspapers, magazines, or any other way, then I would know that that person was telling the truth. It took many years of leads, disappointments, things that we thought would pan out to be the culmination of the case, that we would get our son back, only to be disappointed. It was like a roller coaster. It took 9 long years, and finally, one day, a young man who had been through torturous hell, who had been abused sexually, had been part of a pornography and prostitution ring, was accused of perjury and sex crimes, was sitting in jail. He confided to his attorney, John DeCamp, from Lincoln, Nebraska, that he had taken part in the Johnny Gosch kidnapping. John DeCamp thought, whoa, that's a big case. I better notify the parents. So he called our home, and I happened to be away that night. I was working, and my husband, at the time, my ex-husband, took the call. He went to Omaha, Nebraska, to visit with John DeCamp and to meet Paul Bonacci. He, however, did not tell me, and I did not learn about the existence of Paul Bonacci for another 2 years. He kept it completely quiet. When I did find out about Paul and had the opportunity to hear his statement and to read the diaries that he had kept, logging all of his experiences, including the kidnapping of my son, Paul made mention of the fact that they had a van parked a couple of blocks from the kidnapping site, and that van was used to transport Johnny's body to a location in the state of Iowa, and that the body had been transferred from one car to this van, and that is the piece of information that the neighbor had seen and shared with our detectives. And I knew then at that time that Paul Bonacci was telling the truth, because that piece of information had never been repeated, had never been shared with anyone. It was kept in our files for our own information only. And what transpired from that situation, when I was finally told that Paul Bonacci existed, it was my shock that no one believed him. I went to our police department. I went to our FBI. They said he was a nut. They said he was not credible. They said that he had multiple personalities due to the programming, mental programming, and the abuse that he was put through or claimed to have been put through, and that not one word of his statement could be taken as fact. I had not ever met John DeCamp until many years later, but during the time that Paul Bonacci was being disputed constantly, he never wavered from his story. What he said about Johnny's kidnapping verbatim remained the same after 11 long years. The kid was not lying. A lot of times when people manufacture things, they do not remember what they said to whom, so they trip themselves up. Paul didn't do that. If Paul did not know the answer to a question that you would ask and when you were interviewing him, he would say, "I'm sorry, I don't know that." But if he did know the answer, he would tell you the truth, and that would be the statement that he would use every time he would be asked that question. He never changed even a word. That impressed me. One of the things that happened at the time that Paul, or just about the time Paul was coming forward with all of this, but it had not made the news yet, I was invited to be on a TV show, one of many network shows, and I was on with 3 psychics, and it was the Geraldo Rivera show. They were going to have these psychics make an attempt to solve Johnny's case. The one psychic said she wanted to talk to me after the show, privately. So I agreed. She came into my dressing room and she said, "I didn't want to say this on the air because it's just for you. There's a young man that's going to be coming forward with the truth about your son, and it's going to involve a long, long investigation. But he is telling the truth, and you should listen to him." I didn't reveal to her that I already knew about Paul Bonacci, but it was interesting to me that this psychic would pick up on this information and be able to tell me anything. Up to that point, I had not placed too much credibility in the psychics that had come forward on this case, because there had been several hundred that called me, but no one had an answer. What my son was involved in was an organized kidnapping. It was not a random kidnapping. They knew who they were coming after. They had photographs of him ahead of time. I know this because a neighbor of ours saw Johnny being photographed on his way home from school 2 weeks before the kidnapping. The car had out-of-state plates, and the man leaned out the window and had a very long telephoto lens. The neighbor had reported it to the police. The police said, it's not a crime to take pictures, which I can't fault them for that. It isn't a crime to take pictures. But it turns out that those pictures are the ones that the kidnappers had with them the morning of the kidnapping. They knew they were coming after Johnny Gosch. Paul Bonacci was in the back seat. He was young. He was only about 4 years older than my son when he helped to kidnap him. They used a child to lure another child to the car. Many times parents feel that if they tell their kids not to talk to strangers, that's enough. And they're meaning stranger adults. In this case, these kidnappers were very clever because they used a kid to lure a kid, and it worked. Evidently, Johnny came close enough to the car, they grabbed him and pulled him in. And that's why he was kidnapped. That's how he was kidnapped. Paul Bonacci had been part of what became known as the Franklin Credit Union scandal in Omaha, Nebraska. Franklin was a credit union operated by a man by the name of Larry King. Larry King was a fast-rising star in the Republican Party, but he also had quite an appetite for sex with little boys. And he operated a very well-tuned pornography and prostitution operation, where they would use young boys from Boys Town, as this was reported by many victims that came forward. Approximately 80 children came forward, all naming names in Omaha, Nebraska. This was all part of and tied to Johnny's kidnapping. And then I began to recall, 11 years later, that shortly after Johnny was kidnapped, about 3 weeks, there had been an article in the Des Moines Register. And there were 2 young girls taken from Des Moines. They were aged 13 and 14. They were taken to Omaha, and they were put into a pornography ring. They were found, they were returned to Des Moines, and the men were arrested. I took that clipping from the newspaper, and I went to our police chief, and I asked him to investigate it. And he looked at me and he said, I don't have a feel for that, so I'm not going to do anything. I asked him to call the police chief of Omaha just to ask about it. Since Omaha was 2 hours away from Des Moines, that could be feasible that they could have come from Omaha to Des Moines to take these girls. They certainly could have taken my son too. Still, I could get no help from the police. I went to the FBI office and asked the same question. They told me they would not do it. So at that point, I did the only thing I could think of to do, and that was to call a press conference. And when I did, I read the clipping from the paper, and I said to everyone that would listen, the reaction of the police chief and the FBI, that they would not even check out this lead. 4 days after I did that TV interview, I received the first of many death threats. And the man that called me on the phone said, if you don't stop rocking the boat and making waves, you're going to die. And I remember sitting back after I got the phone call and thinking, what boat did I rock? What wave did I make? The wave was asking about Omaha. I was knocking on the back door of the Franklin Credit Union scandal years before the story broke. And the authorities here in Des Moines were not about to let this story break. They were not about to solve Johnny's case. I later found out that our police chief, Orville Cooney, was very good friends with Robert Wadman, who is the police chief in Omaha, Nebraska. They had many parties, orgies, if you will, where they used young boys and girls. Our police chief would travel to Omaha to the parties with Bob Wadman. Bob Wadman was accused of getting one young girl, Alicia Owen, pregnant during one of these episodes. So then it began to make perfect sense to me why our police chief told people to go home at the search site that Johnny was a runaway, why the police chief would not investigate the possible Omaha connection. He was involved with the same people. Now, as sick as that made me feel, I at least knew what I was dealing with. I at least knew what my obstacles were and what I had to continue to do. And I had to continue to keep Johnny's story alive, letting everybody in America know what was happening and that children were being ripped off the streets. At that point, I organized the Johnny Gosch Foundation, and I developed a program called In Defense of Children. And I went on the road. I went on the road speaking in churches, schools, civic organizations, network TV shows. I gave over 700 speeches in 5 years' time. I gave up what I used to call my life, or any type of recreation or enjoyment. I threw myself into this effort. During this time, I drafted and wrote pieces of legislation for the state of Iowa, which I got passed into law. And those laws were patterned for other states concerning missing and abused children. So, to me, Johnny's kidnapping had to stand for something. He was gone, but there had to be some degree of progress that was made in the system because of what happened to him. And it was my job to do it. And I knew that. The speeches and all of the things that I was doing were constantly keeping his name out there. The awareness level was staying up. Every time I did a TV show or a speech, leads and information would trickle in for our investigators to look over and begin to work on. Slowly, piece by piece, we were able to put this huge jigsaw puzzle together and finally know what happened to Johnny Gosch and why and who's responsible and how they profited off of many young children. Kiddie porn is a multi-billion-dollar business in this country. The only reason that it is because of supply and demand and supply. Somebody has to supply the children to the pedophiles who have the yen for young children and the money to pay for it. My son just happened to be one of them.
You ask me a question.
What you're doing, if I'm going along and I'm doing it, and if I haven't included everything, if Ted speaks up and says, Noreen, I want this too,
Yeah, no.
that's
yeah.
not going to hurt anything.
No, you'll edit it out.
Okay. So if you see I'm not getting all of what you want, jump in so we can get it. Okay.
Thank you.
Let me know.
Oh, we're already going. You might want to turn a little bit more towards the TV set with your shoulders, yeah. No, try it back the other way. Yeah, a little bit more towards Ted, yeah. Okay, now bring your head this way. Oh, ain't that special. Okay.
So
that was
very few times I let people tell me this many times what to do in a row.
Okay.
George can tell you that.
We're rolling.
Okay. The FBI from day one refused to investigate this case. But the thing I think that appalled me and amazed me most was that after Paul Bonacci had come forward and identified the fact that there was a van parked on another street. After we had learned this in the neighborhood search that our private investigators did, the FBI, when it was presented to them, still said that Paul Bonacci was not credible and they would not investigate that aspect of Johnny's case. The FBI never did do the neighborhood search until I complained so many times and so bitterly to our senators, Senator Grassley and Harkin, both from Iowa, that the senators got in touch with the FBI office in Washington, and then the FBI in Des Moines were forced to do the neighborhood search, house by house. And one of the neighbors told me that the FBI was very disgruntled when they showed up to have to do the interview 3 years later, and said the only reason they were coming out to do it is because Mrs. Gosch forced it through the senators, that they had not intended to do it at all. The whole point with all of this, in my mind, is why. Why would a police chief not investigate? Why would he not do the things necessary to try and find my little boy? And why would the FBI refuse to investigate a bona fide kidnapping case that had witnesses? Why would they keep saying, "We have no crime"? I got so sick of hearing that phrase, "we have no crime," that it just about destroyed me. Were they that stupid? Did they not know how to investigate a case like this? Were they naive? Were they just compliant in protecting some bigwig that was a pedophile? Or were they involved in it themselves? Those are the questions that I've had all these years, and I have formed my own opinion as to why I think they did not investigate my son's case properly. And I believe that it is the last. It is involvement. A few months after my son was kidnapped, approximately 6, there was a young boy kidnapped on the way to school. He was a high school kid, and he was driving an Eldorado Cadillac. And the kidnappers used the kid's cell phone to call the parents and tell them that they wanted a ransom demand of money. The FBI sent in many agents to Des Moines. They had the kid back within 36 hours. The next day, the FBI came to my home to gloat at how well they did the case. And Special Agent Herb Hawkins, who was in charge of a 5-state area, led the team as they came into my home. And he said to me that they really had to work on that case because there was a human life at stake. And my reaction was, well, what do you think my son is? Don't you think his life matters? And Herb Hawkins said to me, and I will never forget this, he looked at me and he said, "Mrs. Gosch, there's something you don't understand. The other family, they're very wealthy. They're very prominent in Des Moines. We had to search for their son because they just are more prominent people than you are." Mr. Hawkins had no idea, but he did me a favor that day because he told me what the story really was. And I don't remember doing this, but I evidently picked up a coffee cup full of hot coffee, and I hurled it across the room, and the cup and the coffee missed Herb Hawkins' face by about 1/4 of an inch. At that point, he said, I can see that you're distraught. Is there anything I can do for you? And I said, yes, you can get the hell out of my house. Don't ever come back. If you're not going to investigate my son's case, then step aside because I'm coming through. I will find out what happened to my son, regardless of whether you accept the information or whether you don't. I will at least know before I die.
Okay, what about the Johnny Gosch Foundation? Tell us about that and also the laws that you had passed. More details on the laws.
Okay. Johnny was missing only about a month when I decided to form the Johnny Gosch Foundation. The foundation was to help raise money to pay for private investigators to search for Johnny. That was the primary goal in the beginning. As soon as we filed for a 501(c)(3) standing, the IRS contacted us and told us that that had never been granted before for a child that was currently missing, only for a child that had been found dead, and that we would have to prove that we were doing something for other children. And we were put on a 2-year probationary period, which we passed with flying colors, because it was during that time that I drafted the first piece of legislation called the Johnny Gosch Bill. That bill provided for any family who had a missing child to get an immediate investigation started. No more waiting 72 hours, no more dragging the feet. The FBI would be called in and the investigation would start immediately. That law passed, and within 1 month after the governor signed it into law in 1984, the second newspaper carrier from Des Moines, Iowa, Eugene Martin, was kidnapped in the very same manner as my son. He started out on his route, and 2 men grabbed him and threw him in a car, and off they went. Same scenario, same people. The other pieces of legislation that I facilitated in getting passed were laws that pertain to sexually abused children and the ability for them to testify before video cameras instead of having to relate what happened to them in open courtroom in front of their assailant. We passed a number of laws in 1 year that all had components to the sexually abused child, and we called it the Children's Bill of Rights. A lot of our laws that we passed here in Iowa were adopted by other states that border Iowa, so that we had some uniformity in the central part of the United States as to some type of code on missing and abused children. And it was about at the same time that the National Center for Missing Children in Washington, D.C. was formed. They had gathered parents of missing children and flown us all to Texas to testify before the Justice Department on video. We were to tell what went wrong in our cases, and we were to name names in terms of the police chief, the FBI, whoever didn't do their job. We were to explain how they didn't do it, why they didn't do it. I was one of the parents that participated. When it was my turn to speak, I related what happened to my son and the mistakes on the case. At the end of my speech, I stated that if the FBI was not going to investigate missing children's cases, then the Justice Department should cut their funding. And they should take that amount of money and give it to the organization to start a missing children's center, so that those of us who have missing children would have some government agency to turn to for assistance. At the time I did that, you could hear a pin drop in the room. John Walsh, who is now with America's Most Wanted, at that time he was just a grieving parent like I was, he came rushing over to me and he said, "I can't believe you said that. I can't believe you said to cut their funding." And I said, "John, I meant it. If they're not going to do the job, cut their funding and give it to someone who will." I said, "I'm very serious about it. Why does everyone think the FBI is a sacred cow that you can't challenge? They didn't do the job for my son. They didn't follow their own code of ethics for the criteria of a kidnapping case. Perhaps if they would have moved a little swifter, Johnny would be with me today." Ken?
Okay, what about your husband being a suspect? You suspect he might be involved?
Okay. A number of years after Johnny was kidnapped, I had the occasion to go to John DeCamp's office in Lincoln, Nebraska. And we were going to be discussing some avenues on the case to help bring it more towards a legal resolution and solving it. I entered the room, and John came over. I had never met him before. And he came over and grabbed a hold of my hand. He was very gracious, and he said, "Oh, Noreen, it is so good to see you again. It's been such a long time." And I looked at him and I said, "John, I've never been to your office before. I've never met you before." He said, "Well, of course you did. You came over here in 1988 or 1989 with your husband. And we all went out to the prison to talk to Paul Bonacci." And I said, "No, it wasn't me. I have never been here." So at that point, John DeCamp called his main secretary and office manager in, and he said, "Didn't John Gosch come over here in 1988 or 89, and didn't he bring Noreen, and didn't we go out to the prison?" And Jan said, "Yes, he did, yes, you did, but it wasn't this woman." And she pointed at me. "He brought somebody else that looks like her. It's not the same woman." I didn't know what to say. I was speechless. They later got out all of their telephone records going back to 1988 and 89, and we discovered that there had been a phone number and a fax number set up in Des Moines where John DeCamp was to call and or fax information on Johnny's case. But he was instructed to never, ever call the Gosch home and disturb Mrs. Gosch, only to use this other number, which has since been disconnected. Since that situation has taken place, I have learned and met 25 other people that all had been introduced to this other woman that my ex-husband made everyone believe was me. She looked a lot like me, and with the help of John DeCamp and the Attorney General of Nebraska, I was able to learn her identity and get her photograph. This made my husband look very suspect. How and why would he have an imposter of his wife, Johnny's mother, traveling around the country with him, going to speeches, going to prisons, speaking in many circles concerning his son? It took me a number of years to find out about all of this, but now that I have the truth, now that I know the information, it makes the big question mark over my ex-husband's head that much larger. What part did he play in this? Why on earth would he need to have an imposter? What was the purpose of all of this? There's no answers at this point other than perhaps he was involved in something that he was trying to keep from me as well. That may come out later. In the meantime, I've written a book, and my book is called Why Johnny Can't Come Home. It gives the entire story of Johnny's kidnapping. Who, how, why. And in this book, you'll find a picture of my ex-husband with the woman that he has professed to others and introduced to others as me. It has come to my attention, and I've been informed, that the woman posing as me, once she learned that her picture is in my book, has now had a stroke. I have not given her name publicly because it is still undetermined as to whether charges will be filed against her for impersonating me. And so until such time as she's charged with a crime, I cannot reveal her name publicly in this format. But all of this went on behind the scenes in the Johnny Gosch case. Now I ask anybody who's viewing this video, does this sound like a normal kidnapping case to you, where some pedophile would grab a kid, use them, and kill them? No. Police FBI not cooperating, someone impersonating the mother receiving death threats. None of these things are typical in a normal kidnap case. Why then was Johnny's case different? Who's involved at the top? Who's pulling strings? Who controls the FBI and the police to the degree that they would not look for a little 12-year-old boy who did nothing to anyone?
That's outstanding. That little section there. That goes in the video.
You should come to one of my speeches. You
should
come to one of my speeches.
I've been to your speeches.
Oh.
Yeah, I remember I had a lecture and you were in the audience and I said, come on up.
That was just a pop-up thing. You should come to one of the ones where I really roar.
Okay, now,
Fire and brimstone.
Noreen Gosch.
Here's what I want you to cover. I want you to cover. Paul was the one that told you that the kids went, that they transferred Johnny to Sioux City and then to Colorado.
Yeah, we didn't do Sioux City.
We didn't do that, so let's cover that. With Paul Bonacci said so-and-so.
I think we'll start back at the van.
Yeah.
Okay. At the time that we learned from Paul Bonacci, who was confirming the fact that there was a van parked on the street with a motor running and a body was transferred to it, or something long wrapped in a blanket was transferred to the van, and Paul identified that situation as Johnny's body being moved. The van pulled out and headed for Sioux City, Iowa. The other vehicle that was involved also left the area, and they all rendezvoused at a farmhouse outside of Sioux City, and it was on the Charlie Kerr farm. On that farm was an old house which has since been burned down, but Johnny was kept in the basement for a period of 2 weeks. He was sexually abused by Paul and one other young man on film. Paul was instructed to do this at gunpoint. After Johnny had been kept there for 2 weeks, a man by the name of, they called him the Colonel, came to the farmhouse and paid the kidnappers cash. Paul remembered seeing many big bills, $100 bills coming out of his wallet. They were paid in cash for doing the job of grabbing Johnny. Paul identified this man as Colonel Michael Aquino. He then heard that Johnny was going to be leaving and going back to Colorado and to the West Coast with Aquino, and Paul did not see Johnny again until 1986 in Colorado, so reportedly at the Colonel's home, where they were having an orgy type of situation with adults using children sexually, and Johnny was there with Paul and many other kids. At that point, Johnny's identity was known as the name of Mark, and his hair had been dyed black to change his appearance somewhat. And Paul then, as I mentioned, lost track of him for a period of years.
Let me interrupt you a minute. You said in Michael Aquino's home in Colorado. Is that right?
Ranch.
Okay.
It was a ranch.
We want you, yeah, because everybody can say, well, there's no credibility here, because I know he doesn't have a home in Colorado. He's got a home in San Francisco, you know what I mean?
Okay. Paul Bonacci reported to us that the ranch that they were taken to in Colorado belonged to the Colonel, and he referenced and referred to the Colonel as Colonel Michael Aquino, and that it was at this ranch in a remote area somewhere up in the mountains is where they had the parties, and all of these people would come where they know that they could use young children. Paul stated that the kids were also flown all over the United States to different parts of the country wherever there was a wealthy, well-heeled pedophile that wanted a boy of a certain description. This was quite common, to move the kids around a great deal. Okay.
Yeah. How about Paul? Now, how about Johnny come to visit you?
Okay. In December of 1996, I was invited to Los Angeles to be on the Lisa Gibbons talk show. I had been on there several times before, and this particular time, she had me on with a group of other mothers who had lost their children, and it was right before Christmas. and she asked if we wanted to give a Christmas message to each of our children if they were still alive. I looked at the camera, and I said, I spoke directly to Johnny, and I said, Johnny, if you're still out there, and if you're alive and you're getting this message, I'll help you in any way I possibly can. I still live in West Des Moines. I've divorced your father, and my name and address are listed in the phone book so that you can find me. Contact me and I'll help you. I then flew home, and it was approximately 3.5 months later, in March of the year 1997, when someone started knocking at my door in the middle of the night. And it was a consistent knock. They kept on knocking and pounding at the door. I went to the door, and I lived alone, and I would not have normally opened the door at that time of night. But I looked out the little security hole in the door, and I could see 2 young men in the hallway. The hall lights were on, and I could see the facial features of one of the boys, and he looked like Johnny. And I said, "Who's there?" And he said, "It's me, Mom, it's Johnny." So I let them in. The one young man that was with Johnny did not talk. He kept very quiet, and he would not give me his name. It was a very emotional reunion, because I had not seen Johnny for many years. But when he came in, I thought he was home to stay. I thought this was his return. And I said, "You're going to have a safe place to stay." I said, "Let me call somebody that can come here tonight and give us some legal advice and some help." And he said to me, "I can't stay. You don't understand. It's not safe." And I said, "You wouldn't be safe if I stayed. They'll kill me." And then my son went on to talk about the high-level pornography and prostitution drug-running group that he had been taken into. And he talked about Colonel Michael Aquino. He talked about some of the local people in Des Moines, Iowa that he knew were involved. People across the country that were in high places politically, he mentioned. Some senators, all the way to the White House. I sat there and I was shocked because I had not heard any of this. And he told me that he wanted me to get his story out. He wanted me to do something that would start to make some arrests happen so that he and the other kids that were involved could someday be free, maybe to go reunite with their families. But at this point, they had no choice but to hide out. He also explained to me that he and a couple of the other boys had stolen a car earlier, several years earlier, and that's how they got away from the actual kidnappers, the ones that actually controlled their movements on a daily basis, keeping them in safe houses across the country. And that when they stole this car, they went to one of the boys' homes, and his father was a CPA in another city, a very well-respected man. They stayed there several days. And from that house, Johnny and one of the other young boys went to an Indian reservation to live. And Johnny ended up living on many Indian reservations in seclusion, disguising himself, making himself look like a Native American during that period of his life. And he did that to avoid being found. He went to an Indian reservation to avoid being apprehended, if you will, by authorities, because it's a sovereign state. They knew they'd be safe on an Indian reservation. He remained there until publicity again started to reach a high level nationally concerning his case. Then he left the last Indian reservation and has gone on to remain in hiding in other places of the country. During the time that he did remain on the Indian reservation, he fell into probably another form of control, another form of crime level, and many of the kids that are taken into this type of crime will not ever ask for help. They won't go to their parents. They won't go to police for help because they've been forced to commit felonies. While my son was here with me during our visit, which lasted about 2.5 hours, these are many of the things that he related to me, the hows, the whys, many of the details. He did not, however, tell me the intimate details of the type of abuse that he received. I knew that it was sexual, and I think that he did not want the embarrassment for himself and the hurt for me to have to hear it. At one point, he said that he was going to have to leave because he couldn't stay any longer. And as much as I hated to see him go, I knew that he had to go for his own safety. When he and the other young man left my home that night, I ran outside after them, and they disappeared into the night on foot. I did not see any cars they got into. I did not hear any engines start up. So I know that they had to have had a car parked some distance away and then walked to my place so that they could slip away easily without being noticed. That was the last time that I saw my son. That meeting was very meaningful to me because I knew that he had seen the broadcast that I was on. I knew that all the TV shows that I was doing was for a reason, a good reason. The off chance that my son might see the message, that I was still looking, I still cared, and I still love him.
Did he mention any snuff films?
During the time that we were together, Johnny mentioned that there were children that were killed during the filming of certain sexual films, and that those were called snuff films, and that those sold for very high prices, and they always had people who would pay the money for them. And in that type of a film, there had to be more children used because the main character died. And he did explain how that worked as well. A lot of people in America don't want to think that this is happening, let alone the degree of filth that is associated with it. But it is real, it is happening in our country, and not as many kidnap cases receive the amount of publicity that Johnny's did. So that is why a lot of people don't think we have a problem in our country, is because you don't hear about it as much. I made Johnny's case a national case. I became his publicity agent in order to keep the story alive. But rest assured, a multi-billion-dollar business continues, and they have to have the children to do it.
Did Johnny mention anything about other children being kidnapped, him being involved in, like Paul was, as a decoy and so forth?
One of the things that disturbed Johnny a great deal, as he explained it to me, is that when they have the kids and they start to grow up and they outlive their usefulness in terms of a sexual object, they then are turned into perpetrators to kidnap other children. While they're still young, they're used as lures to lure other children. But in adulthood, they're turned into perpetrators. And so I am sure he didn't give details about his own involvement in that, but I am sure he has seen that side of it as well. And it would probably be considered by many that he would have committed and broken the law, committed crimes and broken the law himself for such acts.
Okay, what about naming names? Who did he identify? I know Aquino's the only one name you've mentioned so far.
That was, when Johnny was here, he did name names, some of which have never been spoken of before to me. Michael Aquino was the big one that he talked about the most. But in terms of the politicians that he mentioned, he has stated the very same ones that Paul Bonacci and many others have named and have been damned for doing it. And do you want me to name the same ones?
I don't know how we'll put it in, but let's put it on camera.
Okay. Some of the names that have come through other victims as well as my son is the names of...
I wrote a letter to the FBI, and I said, election fraud violation. Right? I spoke to the U.S. Attorney first, because I knew the FBI would probably ignore me. And she wrote me a nice letter back and said, I'm referring this to the FBI.
How did they know Johnny was going to be alone that morning? And I heard something in court that I'd never heard before, anywhere. Paul Bonacci straightened up in the chair, and he said, well, they made prior arrangements with Johnny's father. How did they know Johnny was going to be alone that morning? And I heard something in court that I'd never heard before, anywhere.